Bishop of Basingstoke, and this Lent we've faced unique challenges, haven't we? And also working out how do we enter into the story of Lent, Holy Week and Easter, particularly in 2021. We've been helped by Hannah Steele's book, Living His Story, revealing the extraordinary love of God in ordinary ways. I think you'll agree with me that one of the features of the pandemic is ordinary acts of kindness have had an extraordinary impact on us. People who've gone about doing their normal jobs of service to the community, keeping the supply chain open, keeping our hospitals running, continuing to work in laboratories to research how we cope with the pandemic, have all gained our admiration. They've kept going on. But there are also some very big questions that I think we're uniquely having to face as the Christian community. I heard last week someone say, if you haven't got an answer to death, you've not got anything to say at all. And for me, another big crisis in our own context is that of the unbearable isolation that many people have experienced over nearly a year. Of course, we find echoes of both an answer to death and an answer to isolation in the story of Lent, Holy Week and Easter. Hannah Steele in her book says that as we share our faith, we invite other people to step into God's story, to discover that they reframe who they are and who God is and God's love for the world through their understanding of who Jesus is. I found that really helpful over the last few months. When you read the gospel story, you find Jesus often in conversation with individual people, sometimes named, but certainly personal conversations in the gospel record. There are over 300 questions that Jesus asks his audience, and there are a few that people ask Jesus. Pilate, Jesus stood before him on trial, says to Jesus, "What is truth?" One of the most dramatic ironies in the whole story, for there is truth standing in front of him. The longest conversation that takes place in the gospel record is the conversation between Jesus and the woman at the well in Samaria. It deals very personally with who she is, some of the challenges she's faced, some of her isolation, but it's also deeply theological. He talks about prayer and worship. And in the end, there's such a compulsion to the story that she goes to the village and says to everyone, come and meet a man who knows everything about me. And so that story goes on. The events of Holy Week and Easter involve Jesus deliberately leaving Galilee and walking intentionally towards Jerusalem. I first went to Israel when I was 18. And I've been going back fairly regularly ever since. And I always try to recapture something of the geography and the timings of the life of Jesus. I love walking the hills around Galilee, imagining him teaching the crowds, people compelled by coming to listen to him. But I always try and make a point of calling into Jericho. Jericho, the city on the way to Jerusalem, where Jesus meets two people, Zacchaeus, isolated because of his selfishness, his greed and his wealth, and blind Bartimaeus at the edge of the gate of the city, desperate. Both call out to Jesus. Both get met by Jesus. As an aside, I've always wanted to know what happened to those two men after they met Jesus. What happened to that city when a blind beggar can now see and work, when a wealthy man has become generous and gives everything away? I asked a confirmation class about it, saying, I get a bit irritated by this story. What happened next? A young 13-year-old man said to me, Bishop, it's obvious. The story gets finished in your life and mine. The story gets finished in your life and mine. That's the key to living his story. Once we get to Jerusalem, Jesus calls at Bethany, meets a close family who are his friends, Mary, Martha, their brother Lazarus has died. Desperate sadness. We see the poignancy of Jesus weeping. Why weren't you here, Jesus? If you'd been here early enough, you could have done something. And we're told Jesus starts to weep. He calls Lazarus out of the tomb, out of the grave. Death faced head on. Jesus, if you like, in a bubble with Mary, Martha and Lazarus, coping with deep personal bereavement. But the story continues to Jerusalem. Jesus intentionally heading towards the place of conflict, the place where they're going to shout for him to be crucified, where they will nail him to a cross. Is the story all over? On that first Easter Sunday, just before sunrise, the women go to the tomb. They're taking spices to dress Jesus' body and to make sure that it's treated with dignity. He's died, he's dead, he's buried, the story is all over. But when they arrive at the tomb, they find the stone has been rolled away. The grave clothes are folded. He's not there. Death is defeated. And as they turn and meet him, they go running to tell the story. Death is swallowed up in victory. Mortality is defeated in the resurrection. Jesus is alive. Do you begin to see why I think this compelling story is one that you and I are constantly being invited into? Brueggemann called it a reframing of our lives by living by this different story. And so, what of this Lent, Holy Week and Easter? What story are you living by? What story are you inviting others to participate in? How do we answer isolation? How do we understand that God is with us? Emmanuel, Jesus is here. I've taken very many funerals over my time as an ordained clergyman in the Church of England. Sometimes I've sat by the bedside of people as they've died, and on a number of occasions they've been a poignant gift of God's peace. People have died well as they have trusted God in that most vulnerable moment of their life. But it's probably true that the few funerals I've been involved in during this last 12 months have been some of the saddest I've ever been involved in. Because there's nothing mitigated in the closing in of life. People haven't been able to say goodbye. There's a deep soul sadness. How do we address those questions? In those moments, do we really believe God is with us? Do we really believe that death is not the end of the story? That we slip away from the land of the dying to be in the place of the truly alive? The Christian faith needs to be able to answer questions in the face of death. And those answers for me begin with the resurrection of Jesus on the first Easter Sunday morning. Across the world, we shout on Easter Sunday morning, "The Lord is risen," and the reply comes back, "He is risen indeed." That hope triumphs over despair. That what was decaying and finished is transformed into resurrected life. Will you with me pray that we enter afresh into that story? Yes, because it will change us, but also for the sake of the world. Shall I pray? Father, you sent your Son, who lived and died and rose again. As you invite us into that story, the story of Jesus, risen Lord, pray that we might be transformed and offer something of that story to all who share our lives. Amen.